Dong-Hyun will talk about the implications of aging for fiscal sustainability. Thank you, Dong-Hyun.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eduardo, and also many thanks to Many thanks to HelpAge and UNFPA and the government of Vietnam for inviting me here to this important forum. So let me begin. Sorry for that slight technical delay. So the topic that was initially assigned to me was fiscal sustainability, demographic change or population aging and fiscal sustainability in Asia. So it was a simple idea. How does population aging affect Asia's public finances and more specifically the fiscal health over time? But then I thought it might be interesting to add a new angle. Actually, Eduardo suggested this new angle, and that was the inequality or inclusive growth angle. So my presentation today will be based entirely on ADB research, quite recent ADB research, so I'll cite those references, cite the knowledge products upon which this presentation is based. The most recent one done here with Professor Sang-Yup Lee sitting right there it was precisely on this topic. The ADB working paper came out April 2016. You can easily get it on the internet. Of course, it's free. The title is Demographic Change and Fiscal Sustainability in Asia. But in addition to that, I made use of two additional works. One is a 2013 ADB book. It was published by Edward Elgar. Again, Sang-Yup was involved. He was one of my research partners for that project as well. Aging, Economic Growth, and Old Age Security in Asia. An Edward Elgar book published by, an ADB book rather, published by Edward Elgar in 2013. And last but not least, an ADO, Asian Development Outlook, that's ADB's annual flagship report, 2014 special theme chapter. It was on fiscal policy for inclusive growth. So, and of course, we also made a book out of that, a Routledge book that came out in 2015. It's titled Inequality, Inclusive Growth, and Fiscal Policy in Asia. So these are the 3 to 4 books, or 3 to 4 knowledge products upon which I based my presentation today. So let me start by giving you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. The first thing to note is that population aging or demographic change, it affects both government spending as well as government revenues. So quite naturally, it affects fiscal sustainability over time. So what we do is that we project government revenue, government expenditure, and fiscal balance in developing Asia up to 2050 using a very simple model and using the NTA, National Transfer Accounts database. One of the leaders of this NTA project is, of course, Sang-Yup Lee. And then what we find is for rapidly aging high-income countries in Asia, your Koreas, your Taipei Chinas, your Singapores, aging will indeed have a visible, tangible, negative impact on fiscal sustainability, as you might expect. But for middle-income countries as well as lower-income countries, the damage will be much more limited, at least in our time horizon. So, but if you want to look at the big picture, our results suggest that overall, if you look at the big picture, yes, Asia's population aging will have negative impact on fiscal sustainability. So what this does is it points to a very clear need for better analysis, more and better analysis, and data on the interaction between population aging on one hand and public finances on the other hand. And then at a broader level, though, the key to achieving more inclusive growth that benefits broader segments of the population as well as provides productive opportunities for everybody, including the elderly, without sacrificing fiscal sustainability. The key to doing that, there's only one key to that. I think everybody knows the answer, is to have healthy economic growth. Without healthy economic growth, you really cannot promote equity while maintaining fiscal sustainability. Although this might seem far removed from Asia, because by and large, we in Asia have pursued sensible, responsible fiscal policies, but I think to get us motivated, right, to get us motivated for my presentation, I think it's instructive to briefly talk about the case of the very sad, the disastrous, to be more precise, case of Venezuela, because it just shows the critical importance of fiscal sustainability. You can play Robin Hood all you want, and playing Robin Hood is nice and good and everything, but most definitely not in the economically illiterate, fiscally irresponsible way that this, what's this guy's name, Hugo Chavez and his successor did. Of course, that ran the country into the ground, that completely ruined the economy, and it brought endless suffering for the whole population, including the poor. Let me correct it, especially the poor, because poor Venezuelans, unlike rich Venezuelans, they do not have nice bank accounts in Miami, and they do not have Miami schools to send their children to. So those who suffer the most from these kinds of economically illiterate, idiotic economic policies, fiscal policies, is the poor, ultimately. So I think it's although we in Asia are very far removed from that, I think it's absolutely important to keep that in mind, because fiscal sustainability absolutely critical if governments wants to really help the poor, rather than getting votes for 2-3 years and the country goes to the dogs, as happened in the case of Venezuela very clearly. Okay, so I think that's makes the case for fiscal sustainability and its importance in inclusive fiscal policy quite clear-cut. So let me briefly talk about what is the role of fiscal policy in promoting equity. Okay, something that we all know, developing Asia has done remarkably well. We've grown much faster than, in part because our governments rather did not pursue Venezuela, Hugo Chavez-like policies by and large. So we've done much better than other parts of the developing world. If you look at the brown bars, that's our average growth rate, GDP growth rate. No, the blue dot is the average GDP growth rate between 1990 and 2010. Of course, one of the biggest benefit, I would say the single biggest benefit from that sustained rapid growth was our amazing, remarkable, spectacular poverty reduction represented by the brown bar, as you can see. We've reduced poverty on a much bigger scale, at a much faster pace than Middle East, than Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, as you can see. So that is very nice, but we are now confronted with a new, less positive, actually negative, very negative reality. It is that inequality is worsening. Of course, we are not unique in this. Thomas Piketty's book on, Capital in the 21st Century, that's about inequality in the rich countries, right? In the US, UK, France, those guys. But we in Asia, we're also experiencing an increase in inequality, which is a bad thing. Ultimately, it's bad for growth. And you don't, of course, IMF produced this very influential working paper, I think it was last year, but I don't think you need fancy, sophisticated econometric analysis to know that inequality is bad for growth, because what is at the end of the day, what lies behind popular support for capitalism, popular support for free enterprise, it's the simple notion, of course, we all know that the private sector, entrepreneurship, right? Capitalism is what, at the end of the day, what creates growth, what creates wealth, what creates jobs. Government bureaucrats sitting in their desks, they're not the guys who do that. They can, of course, create an environment that is conducive to entrepreneurship, private enterprise, and economic growth. But at the end of the day, that's very good, but we in Asia, we're also suffering from this growing increase in inequality between the rich and the poor. And again, that's bad for growth, because at the end of the day, if you think about it, if you don't have the feeling, with talent, with creativity, with hard work, anybody can make it, right? Anybody can aspire to be a creative entrepreneur, to be a Steve Jobs, or, maybe not somebody as grand as that, but anyway, a productive entrepreneur who creates jobs, who creates income, who creates wealth. If you don't have that popular feeling, of course, popular public support for capitalism necessarily erodes, as is happening in the US and the rise of guys like, amazing if you think guys like Donald Trump, right? That's what explains the rise of Donald Trump, Brexit, and many, many other things. But the point here is inequality also a problem in Asia. And if you look at these countries, they're not Pacific microstates. There are some populous countries here, China, PRC, India, right? Big countries, and also countries at very different income levels, from Bangladesh at the bottom all the way up to Korea and Singapore at the top. So, it's a problem. We are facing a new problem. What to do about it? Well, the global experience clearly shows that fiscal policy, and in particular, public spending, can help to, let me keep track of time. Public spending in particular, spending on education, spending on health, and transfers and subsidies can have a very tangible impact on reducing inequality. But here in Asia, we traditionally used fiscal policy, public spending, to support economic growth rather than to redistribute income. And to me, personally, that is perfectly understandable. Everybody's talking about G2 now. US and China are the two giants of the world economy. They call the shots for the world economy. All that is nice and good, but up to just 30 years ago, make that 25 years ago, Asia was a very poor region. It was a largely low-income region. Now we are a largely middle-income region. We were a largely low-income region. There was no pie to divide. So quite rightfully, entirely, we were not Norway. So quite understandably, entirely appropriately, in my view, the objective of public policy, including fiscal policy, was to support growth rather than to divide up the pie. But of course, now we've reached a certain income level. Asians are now caring more about quality of growth rather than just growing as fast as possible, right? So quality of growth can mean concerns about the environment. But I think just as importantly, perhaps even more importantly, it also refers to concerns about inequality, right? That the gap between the rich and poor, it should not be zero. That should kill off all economic incentives. It would kill off all Steve Jobs in the making, but it should be manageable. It should not be so gapingly wide and growing as it is in many Asian countries today. So what is the problem then? The problem is this. Currently, we not only lag the rich countries, OECD, but we lag our comparator region. In other words, countries that are at similar income levels, that being Latin America, significantly in terms of income, in terms of public spending, whether it's education or healthcare or social protection, and we also lag Latin America significantly in terms of tax revenues, by the way, although I didn't put the graph for that here. So it's a really tough dilemma that we are facing right now. How do we use fiscal policy to promote growth, to promote inclusive growth without sacrificing healthy public finances? And let's face it, you can talk all you want about cutting waste and spending government money more efficiently, but if Asia is serious about using fiscal policy, using public policy to promote equity, to promote more inclusive growth, I think without even any detailed analysis, it should be quite clear that there will have to be at least some increase in public spending financed by some increase in tax revenues, government revenues. But this is causing a lot of tension throughout the region, a lot of conflict, a lot of dilemma. So the challenge facing us, using fiscal policy to promote inclusive growth without financing sound public finances, that is the challenge that's facing us. So in order to fulfill that challenge, we must really strengthen our revenue base. And this is not about increasing tax rate. Yes, we all know that Asia's relatively low tax rate can be an advantage, right, rather than a cost. But when I say Asia must strengthen tax revenues, the generally strengthen revenue base, let me just give you an example. I think this will come out more clearly. I did this presentation like 3 years ago in Bangkok, right? UNSCAP in Bangkok. The director of research said, "Oh, that's entire." He was going, "Oh, yeah, I fully agree with you," and so forth. And what do you fully agree with? And he said, in Pakistan, that was his home country, about 10 million people, right, should be paying income taxes, right? The middle and upper middle class guys in Karachi, Lahore, and so forth, right? I presume. And he asked me, "Do you know the number of Pakistani who actually pay their personal income taxes?" It's 100,000. So that's the kind of improvement in tax revenue collection I'm talking about, not raising marginal income tax rate from 20% or whatever it is to 22%. Of course, Asia must also spend more efficiently, calibrate our spending, so that we better target our spending to help the poor rather than to subsidize the guys driving their $50,000 SUVs in Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur. Although I understand that Indonesia and Malaysia did implement significant fuel subsidy reform, and that's good to them. Okay, now, when we talk about inclusive growth, I think it's impossible to talk about inclusive growth without talking about old age poverty. Why? Because a large and growing share of Asia's population is old. Many older Asians are poor, and even more older, many more older Asians are vulnerable or are at risk of falling into poverty. So it's absolutely nonsense to talk about inclusive growth in Asia without talking about old age security, old age economic security for the elderly in Asia. In other words, this is an obvious statement, but I think it is important at this forum, so let me say it. A society in which the elderly cannot lead humane, dignified, productive, fulfilling, rewarding lives cannot possibly be an inclusive society, and an economic growth paradigm that excludes the old cannot possibly be inclusive growth, inclusive kind of growth. But, and furthermore, yes, fiscal policy, public spending on pensions, public spending on healthcare, and very importantly, in countries that are at the advanced stage of aging, such as Korea and others, long-term care, public spending on long-term care, yes, these kinds of public spending can provide much-needed support for the elderly and thereby promote inclusive growth, but I think we cannot get away from that fact, unfortunately. There's no free lunch in the world, and we certainly don't want to go down the slippery slope to Hugo Chavez and his Venezuelan catastrophe, disaster experiment. Population aging itself is going to affect public finances and, over time, fiscal sustainability, and hence the government's ability, capacity to support the elderly. Okay, moving right along. So what is the role of population aging? Well, I think it's quite clear when the population ages, when the population becomes older, the structure of the population age changes. That's going to affect the government spending. It's also going to affect tax revenue. Just two examples. Relatively more children will mean, other things equal, more public spending on education. More elderly, relatively more older people will mean more public spending on healthcare, pensions, and long-term care. On the other hand, if you have a relatively larger working age population, that would mean more tax revenues. Of course, and the population data is there. Unfortunately, and this is one of the key messages from our working paper, Fiscal Sustainability, Demographic Change and Fiscal Sustainability in Asia, which, by the way, was just last month accepted in a pretty strong journal, and it will be coming out as a journal paper soon. But anyway, one of the key messages of that paper was that the data on the interaction between the demographic structure and the economy, including public finances, including fiscal policy, is very much underdeveloped, very much half-baked, very much rudimentary. So there's a serious gap, data gap, information gap, that we will have to fill if we are going to undertake more meaningful analysis in the future. So let me go straight to the results. Just to note that the government spending and revenues are driven by two factors. One is change in population age structure. More old people, more young people, relatively more working age population, and so forth. That kind of change in demographic structure, but also change in spending at each age. And that the biggest driver implicitly here is income, GDP per capita. As we know from, it's a well-known stylized fact, as countries grow richer, their citizens typically demand more and better public services. That is why OECD countries, the government spending to GDP ratio in OECD countries are much, much higher than they are in developing countries, including developing Asian countries. So two drivers really, population age structure change and the per capita income increase, which changes public spending at each age, whether that's 15 years old or 25 years old or 55 years old. And we follow the methodology of Lee, Sang-Yup again, and Andrew Mason. So this is so these are some of the results we get. So I'm not going to go into numbers. Take a look. Like in the interest of time, I'll move after 10 seconds or so. And then, if you just some general points that arise, on average, so this is an arithmetic average, not a GDP-weighted average, so it's very imprecise. The increase is 3.3% rise in the percent of GDP spent on public expenditure between 2010 and 2050. 24.4% of GDP to 27.7% of GDP. This is tax revenue projections using the very simple simulation model using the NTA, National Transfer Accounts data again. This is what we get. And government revenue, right, which is larger than tax revenue, this is what we get, okay? So these are some of the results that we get. And of course, we made projections for public spending. We made projections for government revenue. Then we can, then the difference, right, or the balance, of course, is fiscal balance, right, or government budget deficit or surplus, as the case may be. So if you think, what is somewhat interesting is some of you might be a little bit surprised, but actually, I think this also resonates with what I think it was Philip said earlier. Things for Asia are not as bad as they are in perhaps other parts of the world. So actually, if you think about it, this is government spending, revenue, tax revenue. But if you look at the fiscal balance, actually it improves if you look at Asia as a whole. And we are not just talking about very small countries. Along with Bhutan, the country where fiscal balance is expected to improve the most is in fact China, the PRC. So these are not driven by Pacific microstates either, although it is an arithmetic average. So the key findings, let me go over the key findings verbally. So I think in terms of the projections, what we find is, yes, as you might expect for high income, rapidly aging countries, and these are countries where population aging is a here and now problem. It's a clear and immediate danger. Countries like my country, Korea, for example, in those countries, yes, population aging or demographic change, if you will, is going to have a significant negative impact on fiscal health. On the other hand, many middle-income countries, and Vietnam, I'm fully aware, just 2 weeks ago I read an article in The Economist. Vietnam finally graduated into a middle-income country, right? And it's poised to become the next Asian tiger, right? Of course, given that it successfully overcomes certain structural obstacles, which it has every chance of overcoming. But anyway, on the other hand, many middle and low-income Asian countries may experience significant improvement in their fiscal positions despite population aging. And that's, of course, due to rapid economic growth or projected rapid economic growth. But at the same time, we should remember Vietnam is following just as Korea is following in the footsteps of Japan, although very rapidly, there's almost no gap between the two. Vietnam, with a little more lag, a little more distance, will be following the footsteps of Korea. So actually, the time to start preparing for population aging, both in terms of sustaining economic growth as well as in providing affordable, adequate, and sustainable support for the elderly, the time to prepare for these two strategic challenges posed by population aging is, in fact, now, even for countries like Vietnam. I think data limitations, I think we should qualify our findings in that the data is very limited, has a lot of holes in them, let's put it that way. So, of course, improving the more data, better data in this interaction between population aging and the economy in general, but more specifically public finances, is a very key challenge going forward. So let me just conclude by noting that for Asian countries, public programs are an important source of support for the elderly and growing, increasingly important. So the question really becomes, how do we maintain these kinds of current old age support systems when the population is aging very rapidly? All the more so because our results suggest that population aging can lead to very sharp, very substantial increase in public spending, and equally alarmingly or equally concerningly decrease in revenue. So I think a key priority everywhere must be to improve our understanding of the connection between population age structure, tax burden, and the needs of everybody, including the elderly. So as you can see, family support, we are actually, in Asia, we are caught between two places. On the one hand, our children, right, are not as supportive of their parents, let me put it neutrally, like as before, because of erosion of traditional values, cultural values, and so forth. On the other hand, we do not yet have well-developed, strong, well-established pension system. So we are really caught in a big hole in between. So it's filling that hole by building up strong pension system. That is obviously a key priority in achieving more inclusive growth that does not leave behind the region's large and growing army of elderly. So as I said, and I must repeat this because it's an important point, because many people might think population aging and inclusive growth, they're unrelated things, but they're very related things if you think about it, right? Because again, a country, a society where many elderly people cannot live humane lives, decent lives, fulfilling lives, productive lives, rewarding lives, that kind of society cannot possibly be an inclusive society, and the growth, economic growth that excludes the elderly cannot possibly be an inclusive growth. So what is required in Asia is a significant increase in public spending on the elderly, pensions, healthcare, long-term care, cash transfers for the very poor elderly. Of course, but as I said earlier, that creates a dilemma for us, right? That can jeopardize fiscal sustainability, all the more so because population is aging, and in and of itself, aging population aging is bad, right? It's harmful fiscal sustainability. But I would like to end this on a positive note, because if you think about it, just go back to when we had the opposite problem. And everything in Asia happened so fast. We had the opposite problem. Too many people, right? Too many babies. That was just a generation or generation and a half ago in many countries, including even in high-income countries like Korea, and of course Philippines still to some extent suffers from that problem, right? Too many babies, too many people, too many children, too many mouths to feed. So everybody was worried. But Asia was able to successfully tackle that challenge because we put into place good, strong institutions, such as flexible labor markets and investing a lot in education, especially primary education, and good, strong policies. So I think in the case of Africa, everybody's saying, oh, Africa is the next big growth market and so forth. And they're basing that largely on the fact that Africa is population-wise a young continent. But of course, in order for Africa that demographic dividend, right, it's not free. You have to do a lot of hard work to realize it. So but of course, if Africa too puts in the kinds of good, sound policies and institutions that Asia did in the past, of course, Africa too stands to reap a sizable demographic dividend instead of sending migrants across the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean, right, for lack of economic opportunities as it is now doing. And on a final note, very much related to that, just as Asia tackled our too many babies, too many people problem before, I think there's every reason to believe that with sound good policies and institutions, for example, improving the quality of our education so that we get more graduates with actually usable job skills rather than just a piece of paper. So as long as we put in good policies, sound policies, that helps to minimize the negative impact of population aging, I think Asia will be in relatively good shape going forward. Thank you very much.